The first snowstorm of that winter arrived like a silent warning no one took seriously. Heavy gray clouds rolled over the small mountain town of Silver Creek, Colorado, and the wind pushed icy air down from the Rockies with a quiet but growing intensity. Most people in town prepared the way they always did, stacking a little firewood by the porch, filling the pantry with canned food, and trusting that winter would pass like every other year. But far outside town, beneath a hidden patch of frozen earth in the woods, thousands of carefully stacked pieces of dry firewood waited in silence. No one in Silver Creek knew it existed. And even more astonishing, no one knew it had been buried there years earlier by a homeless 16-year-old boy who had once been thrown out into the cold with nowhere else to go. That forgotten underground stockpile would soon become the one thing standing between survival and disaster for the entire town. Before this incredible story continues, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel if you believe in silent heroes and second chances. Sometimes the people society ignores end up saving everyone. Years earlier, the boy's name was Ethan Miller. He had grown up in Silver Creek, a quiet Christian community tucked between thick pine forests and steep mountain ridges. Ethan had always been a quiet and thoughtful kid, the kind who preferred exploring the woods to playing loud games with other children. His father, David Miller, had once worked as a logger, teaching Ethan how to split wood, read weather patterns, and understand the forest the way a sailor understands the sea. But life changed quickly after David passed away in a logging accident when Ethan was 14. Without his father's income, the family struggled deeply. Ethan's mother fell into financial hardship and emotional exhaustion, and the tension inside their small home grew heavier every month. Bills piled up, arguments became common, and eventually the fragile household collapsed under the weight of poverty and grief. One cold autumn evening, when Ethan had just turned 16, his mother made a desperate decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Overwhelmed and unable to care for him, she forced him to leave the house with only a backpack and a few blankets. That night, Ethan walked into the surrounding forest with nowhere to go. For the first few days, he survived by sleeping inside an abandoned tool shed near the edge of town. The nights were already growing cold, and Ethan knew the real winter storms were still months away. But the lessons his father had taught him began guiding his decisions. David Miller had always warned him about mountain winters. He once told Ethan that when storms arrived in the Rockies, they could last weeks, sometimes cutting entire towns off from the outside world. Ethan remembered how his father used to store firewood carefully every summer to prepare for those long, cold months. That memory sparked an idea. Instead of leaving the area or begging for help, Ethan began preparing quietly for survival. Each day he traveled deeper into the forest, collecting fallen branches and dead trees. Using an old axe he had found in the shed, he split the wood into manageable pieces. But rather than stacking above ground where it could get wet from snow, Ethan began digging a hidden underground pit beneath a thick layer of pine needles and soil. The idea was simple but clever. Underground storage would keep the firewood dry and insulated from the harsh winter weather. Ethan spent weeks digging the pit carefully between large tree roots where the soil stayed firm and protected. Every day he filled the space with more split logs, stacking them tightly and covering them with wooden planks and dirt. By the time the first snow arrived that year, Ethan had created an enormous hidden reserve of firewood. The underground cache contained thousands of pieces of dry wood. Ethan himself survived that winter by living quietly in the forest, using small amounts of the wood to keep warm while hunting rabbits and fishing in nearby streams. It was a hard life, but he endured it with determination that surprised even him. Eventually, when spring arrived, Ethan found work at a small lumber yard outside Silver Creek. The owner, Robert Caldwell, noticed the boy's quiet work ethic and allowed him to sleep in a small storage room behind the shop. Slowly, Ethan rebuilt his life, but he never forgot the hidden firewood pit deep in the forest. Years passed. The underground would remain buried and forgotten. Then came the winter that would change everything. Meteorologists began warning about a rare polar storm system moving south from Canada. Temperatures were predicted to drop far below zero, bringing record-breaking cold and heavy snow across the mountain region. At first, the town of Silver Creek prepared the same way it always had. But this storm turned out to be something different. Within 2 days, the temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow buried the roads leading in and out of town. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice, and electricity across the region failed completely. Without power, heating systems stopped working. Homes that relied on electric heaters quickly became dangerously cold. Families rushed to burn their limited firewood supplies, but the storm continued day after day without relief. Within a week, most households had burned through nearly all their wood. The town faced a terrifying reality. If the cold continued much longer, people could begin freezing inside their own homes. Ethan, now 19 years old and working at the lumber yard, watched the crisis unfold with growing concern. The town that once ignored his struggles was now fighting for survival against the brutal winter. One evening, while listening to worried conversations at the local church shelter, Ethan suddenly remembered something. The hidden underground firewood. The enormous cache he had buried years earlier still existed somewhere deep in the forest. At dawn the next morning, Ethan borrowed a truck from Robert Caldwell and drove toward the old forest path. The road was nearly buried in snow, forcing him to hike the final mile on foot through waist-deep drifts. After nearly an hour of searching, Ethan finally found the spot. He began digging through the frozen soil with desperate determination. When the shovel finally struck the wooden planks covering the pit, Ethan felt a rush of relief. The underground cache was still there, dry, perfectly preserved, and massive. Ethan spent the entire day hauling armfuls of firewood back to the truck. By nightfall, the vehicle was overflowing with logs. He returned to town and began distributing the wood to families who had completely run out. But the supply was far larger than anyone expected. For several days, Ethan continued traveling back and forth between the town and the hidden pit, delivering wood to homes, churches, and emergency shelters. Soon the entire town realized what was happening. The firewood buried years earlier by a homeless teenager was now heating hundreds of homes during the worst winter storm in decades. Before we reach the ending of this powerful story, take a moment to comment the word second chance below if you believe people who are ignored or rejected sometimes carry the strength that saves others. By the time the storm finally ended and rescue crews reopened the highways, Silver Creek had survived one of the harshest winters in its history. Much of that survival came from a quiet young man who had once been forced into the forest at 16 with nothing but an axe and determination. The same town that once overlooked Ethan Miller now looked at him with deep respect, because the boy who had hidden firewood underground to survive had unknowingly prepared enough warmth to save an entire community.